There are a ton of Armored Core games. Armored Core 6 will actually be the 16th game in the series, and that's only if you don't count ports or the obscure mobile phone games. Iteration versus innovation in games is a topic that I'd like to delve more deeply into on its own at some point, but it's definitely worth mentioning in regards to the Armored Core series in particular. Sequels sometimes feel inevitable in just about any medium if something is financially successful, but video games have a unique opportunity in that they're able to build on gameplay concepts as a result of newer technology, in addition to returning to certain settings, stories, or gameplay formulas. It's also much cheaper to iterate on an existing engine and gameplay concept than it is to develop entirely new ones. This was more of a factor before the HD era, after which both technology and game design calcified to a certain degree, for better or for worse. But even back in the early 80s, we began to see game sequels that were, by and large, extremely similar to their predecessors. This trend has never gone away, and sequels became a major part of the industry with the establishment of long-term franchises in the home console generations that followed. Beyond the obvious financial incentive of creating a sequel to a game that people liked, we as players create expectations and a level of comfortable regularity with franchises the same way we do with anything else that becomes a constant in our lives or greater culture. But when does it go too far? What is the right balance between innovating with fresh IP and ideas and iterating on existing ones? Some franchises handle this better than others, of course. I don't think anyone could deny that the first 6 Final Fantasy games were all extremely iterative, but the gradual changes kept that series critically and commercially successful. The first several Resident Evil titles are all extremely similar before getting a big series shakeup with RE4. There have been 8 iterations of Street Fighter II, and the first 4 of those were released in the same amount of years. How many Dynasty Warrior games are there? Between the main series, expansion games, spin-offs, and crossovers, all of which essentially feature the same gameplay. But before I get too off track, let's return to FromSoftware. Nearly half of all the games released by FromSoftware have been franchise titles, with Armored Core alone representing nearly a quarter of them. With the release of Armored Core 6, they've created just under 60 games to date since their first game, Kingsfield, back in 1994. Kingsfield had several sequels, 3 games between 1994 and 1996, with spin-offs like the Shadow Tower games, and then the 4th Kingsfield title to follow, all within the next 5 years. The Armored Core series had 12 mainline games released between 1997 and 2006. 12 games in 9 years. 3 of those came out in 2004 alone. The pace of release slowed after Armored Core 4, presumably as a result of the much higher budget and development time required to create high-definition caliber graphic assets, as well as now developing for 2 very different game consoles simultaneously. Beyond graphics, AC4 also has significantly less overall content than nearly any of the preceding games, but the core gameplay has remained mostly unchanged. I've expressed my concerns about the stagnation of the Souls formula that I began to feel with Elden Ring, despite still greatly enjoying that game, but even then, From's Souls games consist of 6 titles that were released over 13 years. That's 7 titles if you include Sekiro. Personally, I don't. I had the impression sometimes, while playing some of these Armored Core expansion titles like Project Phantasma, Another Age, and Silent Line, that some of these games may have had less of a budget than their numbered predecessors. Utilizing the same engine, many of the same graphical and audio assets, while making slight iterations on gameplay mechanics and adding new AC parts and a new campaign, allowed FromSoftware to release games that had inherently higher profit-to-cost ratios, which may have been a necessity for their studio to stay afloat. That's not to say that they didn't enjoy making the games, but the practical reality of their budget-to-profit ratio was almost certainly a factor in the rapid production of these games. With their current worldwide popularity and the massive global sales of games like Dark Souls 3, Sekiro, and of course Elden Ring, it may be easy to forget that FromSoftware has been a somewhat niche and smaller budgeted studio for nearly the entirety of their existence. The best-selling title in the series was Armored Core 2, and that had just under 800,000 units shipped worldwide. In comparison, Devil May Cry, released the following year, shipped over 2 million units as a brand new IP, albeit one from a much bigger developer. Final Fantasy X, an established franchise, shipped more than 8 million units, also within the same time period. The constant release of AC games for so many years allowed FromSoftware to stay in the green, giving the hardcore fans a regular stream of new, if similar, releases, while simultaneously being able to indulge in a more experimental title every once in a while. This seems to remain a core philosophy of the studio to this day, with the last decade of their releases only occasionally interspersed with something like Sekiro or Derasine, the latter of which being something that seems genuinely different and experimental, and is a game that I would really like to check out someday. Sometimes while playing through the series, I had wished that FromSoftware had perhaps released less overall games in exchange for ones that could have taken greater steps in iteration, content, and polish, quality over quantity. But it's hard to complain too much though, because I ended up loving several games in the series, enjoying almost all of them, and only outright having a bit of a frustrating time with a few outliers. I also recognize the fact that, although the games were indeed released frequently, playing all of them basically back to back within the last 9 months certainly could have had an effect on my enjoyment. I tried to keep this in mind and tried to be as objective as possible. That being said, I never felt like I was getting sick of the series, only certain games. After finishing Verdict Day, I went back and played a few hours of each of the games that I felt were the best and the worst in the series, and I can safely say that I still feel the same way about each of them. And even then, my total playtime across this entire series is probably less than I've spent in, say, Elden Ring. It's pretty remarkable how great the core gameplay loop is with the first Armored Core. They really nailed it right out of the gate. Do a mission, buy parts, tweak your build, repeat. The controls, while initially hard to deal with, especially if you aren't familiar with the conventions of that era, are still fun and successfully communicate the feeling of operating a big mech. The PS1 generation also featured one of my favorite settings in the series, with that classic dystopian yet colorful cyberpunk aesthetic. The fantastic music in this generation added to this feeling of kicking ass and making a positive difference in a world of corporate oppression of humanity, versus the existentialist and sometimes somewhat nihilistic feeling of the later games. You spend the first half of the game doing horrible things like wiping out striking workers and homeless occupants, but you redeem yourself by the end of the game by releasing society from the grip of the merciless entities in power, and this is all communicated only via minimal in-mission dialogue, emails, and a few extremely brief cutscenes. Master of Arena follows this blueprint more successfully than the somewhat undercooked Project Phantasma, and delivers a more personal story of revenge and artificial intelligence that's interwoven with a fleshed out arena mode in a way that still feels unique to the series. Plus, it's got some of the best multiplayer maps. Armored Core 2 mixes things up with the coolest setting out of any of them, Mars, and again feels like a fully realized experience from top to bottom. Although I felt that the gameplay was a bit of a step down from the PS1 generation, the great storyline, setting, and variety of parts available from the beginning of the game were all excellent. The wonderfully paced feeling of progression of power, the ancient Mars technology aspect, hilarious voice acting, great music, and art direction also makes this one of my favorites in the series. Armored Core 3 is another favorite. It's basically a redo of AC1, but in a more conceptually thoughtful and fleshed out execution. The religious symbolism and concepts incorporated into nearly every aspect of the presentation and storyline that represent the godlike AI that rules society in that game are excellent. It's the strongest overall thematic direction in the series. The core mechanics are as good as the PS1 generation again, but even better, and are of course running at 60 FPS versus the 20 FPS of those games. AC3 also features the best mission variety with a constant flow of diverse objectives and settings. Revisiting it, I was once again struck by just how cool and diverse the missions were. For Answer and Verdict Day are both excellent as well, featuring the currently most fleshed out and dynamic gameplay of the series. We'll see how 6 turns out, but regardless of that, I can safely say that these two are both a ton of fun to play, even if their settings and certain elements of their presentation didn't hook me quite as well as the aforementioned older titles. Having now played all of these games, it's clear that Demon's Souls and subsequent games were a product of FromSoftware, directly combining the central concepts of Armored Core and Kingsfield, their two pillar franchises up until that point. The Souls games have the controls, faster-paced action gameplay, and third-person perspective of the AC games, with a similar dark fantasy setting to that of the Kingsfield series. Obviously, Demon's Souls is not nearly as fast as the AC games, but the general control layout, the methodical give-and-take approach to combat, and functional build variety is similar. In all three series, stamina, or energy management, is a core component of combat. Even the equipment setups are similar if we directly compare Armored Core 4, or For Answer, to Demon Souls. 2 weapons each for the left and right hand. Your equipment weight dictating your mobility and rate of stamina or energy regeneration, having a quick dodge for a primary defensive maneuver. Of course, some of these elements are classic RPG mechanics, but the specific and unique approach to them in Demon Souls and beyond represents a branch of the core FromSoftware gameplay design. Another neat little bit of visual continuity are the Kojima particles from AC4 and For Answer. They are nearly identical to the player's dropped souls in Demon Souls and all 3 Dark Souls titles. Looking at the file hierarchy for AC4 and For Answer, you can see the same folders and data structure that they've used for every game since. I'd be curious to peek into the ISOs for something like Otogi to see if it goes back even further. I wonder how long they've been iterating on this engine. As if the AC games weren't enough, there's also a ton of other mech games by FromSoftware. I might take a look at some of these too at some point, but I think after AC6, I'll need to focus on some non-giant robot content. Anyway, to wrap things up, I'm very happy to have played through all of these Armored Core games. This series is awesome, and I'm happy to see it revitalized in the modern era of FromSoftware. I hope going forward, the series can thrive and get the attention that it deserves. But it would be great to see each new entry spaced out a little bit more, to give each one the resources it deserves, to really try and make each game shine. I have little doubt that Armored Core 6 is going to be a great game. Between the experience, budget, and modern design philosophies of the studio. I will be taking a close look at that game and will be putting out a video on it as well. Until then, thank you very much for joining me on this trip through all of these games. See you next time.